Hey, this is Dane from featherprop.com. Thanks for joining me again today. I had been going through the Olivet Discourse found in Matthew chapter 24. In my last video, I mentioned that I want to pause in that and talk a little bit about the 7-year tribulation, sometimes referred to as the Great Tribulation, and examine whether or not we have biblical evidence to believe that it is going to occur. I know for a lot of people this is just an established fact and it doesn't even need to be questioned, but I think there's nothing wrong with questioning things. Where do we get the basis for some of our beliefs is always a good question to ask. You know, a number of years ago I was invited by a pastor to come to this men's group and talk about eschatology. Not my favorite topic. I'd rather talk about the Sermon on the Mount any day, but I said, okay, I would, and I agreed and I came, and he pulled me aside when I got there and said, okay, what do you believe? Are you pre-trib? Are you mid-trib? Are you post-trib? And it's interesting what that question assumes. It assumes that there is a tribulation. There is a 7-year period of tribulation. He just wanted to know how I stand in reference to it. Do I believe the rapture before, in the middle, at the end, or somewhere in between, something like that? Well, you know, I think it's good for us to take a look at our assumptions and to see where they come from. So in this video, I want to take a look at the biblical evidence for a 7-year tribulation. First of all, the word tribulation appears many times in the New Testament. It just means trial or testing. It literally means to be under pressure. But we do not have any verse explicitly saying there will be a 7-year tribulation. So we don't have a verse that says, and lo, the tribulation will last 7 years. You know, we don't have that. That's not a real problem for us because we don't have to have an explicit verse to develop a doctrine. Maybe we can find some verses that support it and kind of indicate that something is such. And so we'll have to look at whether it's implicitly found in the scriptures. Now, some would say, well, what is it? Doesn't the book of Revelation talk about a 7-year period? It doesn't. The words 7-year do not appear in the book of Revelation at all. You can't find it. There is a time frame mentioned of 3.5 years. And some would say, well, 3.5 plus 3.5 is 7. That is true. However, the 3.5-year time frame is mentioned 5 different times. It's used by under different words. For example, twice it's called 42 months. Once it's called a time, times and a half a time. And twice it is called 1,260 days. And all 3 of these phrases mean 3.5 years. So we have it 5 different times. And we don't have any passage in the book of Revelation that says that these 3.5-year time frames have to be joined together. They don't seam them together. There's no passage saying this is the first 3.5 and this is the last 3.5 or anything like that. So I don't think we can develop our doctrine of a 7-year tribulation based on the book of Revelation because it's just simply not found there. It's not solid enough to develop that theology. I think we'd have to find it somewhere else, and then maybe we'd understand it in the book of Revelation better. So where do we get the future 7-year tribulation from? It's really only in one place, which is fortunate for us. We don't have many places to look, and that is Daniel chapter 9, verses 20 through 27. And this is where the doctrine is sort of founded. This is where it sort of begins for those who believe in a 7-year tribulation. Now, in the book of Daniel, chapter 9, an angel, Gabriel, approaches Daniel and gives him a prophecy. This is often called the 70 weeks of Daniel prophecy. And there's a confusing things in here, and I'll try my best to kind of clear them up as we go. I'll do my best because it is a little confusing. So if we go to Daniel chapter 9, verse 24, we read, 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins. So we have the angel telling Daniel this prophecy is about 70 weeks. Now the word weeks here is confusing. It just literally means 7 or sevens. So we have 70 sevens, and almost universally scholars, Bible teachers believe and agree that it's not 70 weeks, but weeks of years. So we have 70 sevens or 70 groups of 7 years. 70 times 7 is 490. And so this prophecy is believed to span 490 years. And so that's how this is introduced in Daniel. Next verse in 25, the angel says, know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until the Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Again, a little confusing. And I don't know why the angel does it this way, because this information isn't used anywhere else that we know of. But he said, from the command, now of course Israel was in Babylon at the time, and they were about to be commanded to return to their homeland, and they could start rebuilding the city and start rebuilding the temple. And the angel said, from that command until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks of years and 62 weeks of years. So we have 2 sets of years. Now 7 plus 62 is 69 weeks of years, or 483 years. Now there were 3 commands given by Babylonian kings, Cyrus, and 2 by Artaxerxes, and it's not really clear, and there is some debate as to which one of those commands sets the clock ticking. And for the purpose of this discussion, I don't need to know that. We just know that the clock began and the 483 years began. So let's go to the next verse, verse 26. After the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. So now, again, we had 7-week time frame and a 62 weeks time frame, and which takes us up to 69. And after the 62, which is at 69, and I understand that's a little confusing, but after the second set, takes us up to 69 weeks, 483 years, the Messiah is cut off. Cut off is a idiom for being judged or for being executed, for dying. And of course, the Messiah he was crucified, and in a sense, he was judged on our behalf. And so we have right up until the Messiah. Then it goes on, and it says, verse 26, and the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. And so we have a prediction of the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, which occurred in 70 A.D. Now, so that is 69 weeks of years, or 483 years. We have a missing 7. Where's the 7th, the last 7 years? Next verse, verse 27, and this is where we have the Great Tribulation doctrine coming from. Verse 27 says, then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. So we have the scripture telling us that now discussing the last week of years, the last 7 years. Now dispensationalists will say that the verse 27 is in our future. Verse 26 was in the past, but between verse 26 and 27 there is a gap of about 2,000 years and counting. And when it says, and he shall confirm a covenant, the he there is a future Antichrist. The future Antichrist will make a covenant with Israel. The temple will be rebuilt. The third temple will be rebuilt. Sacrifices will continue. And in the middle of that 7-year peace treaty, the Antichrist is going to break it, put an image of himself in the temple, and then all hell breaks loose. And that's sort of the Great Tribulation. This is how it's understood. Now, I believe there are some problems with that interpretation, and I'll spell them out for you the best that I can. First of all, to get that understanding of verse 27, you have to import a lot of ideas which are not inherently found there. They're not in Daniel chapter 9. For example, you have to import a future Antichrist. You have to import a rebuilt third temple. You have to import sacrifices will continue. You have to import the Antichrist putting an image of himself inside the temple. All of those things are not found here in Daniel chapter 9. And I believe they're problematic. Let's take a look at one of them, for example, the Antichrist. There's no Antichrist mentioned in Daniel chapter 9. And I don't believe any of his early listeners or early readers, or even later readers, would have understood an Antichrist to be there. It's simply not found in Daniel chapter 9. Obviously, Daniel does not mention the temple will be rebuilt. He mentions it being destroyed, but he doesn't mention it being rebuilt. He doesn't mention the Antichrist making a peace treaty with Israel. All of that is imported from somewhere else, not found here in this text. And especially, there's no indication in this text to suggest we have a gap of 2,000 years between the 69th week of years and the 70th week of years. There is simply none. In fact, the prophecy starts out saying 70 weeks are determined. And so you get a sense, 490 years, that's what we're talking about. Not 2,490 years, but 490 years. So again, there's a lot of things being imported into this passage that are not found there. And So you may say, well, is there another way to read Daniel chapter 9? And I believe that there is, without importing anything. In fact, what I'm going to suggest to you is the natural, obvious way to understand this. If we take a look at Daniel chapter 9 without having all of these doctrines that we have to kind of make fit, let's just read Daniel chapter 9 for what it is, let it interpret itself to us, and see if we reach a similar or a different conclusion. Let's go to Daniel chapter 9 and verse 27, because this is the controversial section. Then he shall confirm a covenant for many for 1 week. Who is the he mentioned here? Now, as I said earlier, dispensationalists believe the he is in the preceding verse. It's the Antichrist, who is the prince to come. The problem with that is, now, let me kind of start over with this. Take you back to your 8th grade English class. When you see a pronoun like he or she or they or we, you have to have an antecedent subject, someone that comes before that so that the reader or the listener can identify the he or she. You know, if we start out a conversation, I just started talking about he did this and he did that, you think, wait a second, who are you talking about? You haven't introduced anybody. So we have to have somebody introduced. Well, dispensationalists say the he here is the Antichrist. And where the Antichrist come from? Well, in the preceding verse, it says the prince to come. The problem with that is the prince to come, or of the prince to come, is a prepositional phrase, and it supports the subject of that sentence, which is the people. The people of the prince to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Well, who are the people who destroyed the city and the sanctuary? Well, of course, they're the Romans. And the Romans were of the prince to come. Now, who would be the prince? Well, I think the natural reading could be Titus. He was the general who led the invasion. Or Vespasian, he was the emperor back in Rome at the time. Or maybe it even implies some sort of spiritual principality. I don't know. Daniel doesn't say. But whoever the prince is to come, that is a supporting phrase to the people, because it's the people who are the subject of that sentence. They destroy the temple and they happen to belong to a prince to come. Now again, this is all future for Daniel. It doesn't necessarily mean it's all future for us. We'd have to decide that on the merits of the verse itself. So is there another way to read it? I think that there is, because when it says, and he shall confirm a covenant, we go back to the preceding sentence and we find the people as the subject of the sentence before, but the people doesn't fit he. That would be they. And so we go back to the previous sentence. Do we find a subject there? And we do. It's the Messiah. The Messiah is the subject of the sentence before the one before he. Now, does the Messiah fit into this? And I think it does. So verse 27, if you read it this way, and he, the Messiah, who's introduced in the sentences before, and he, the Messiah, shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. Did Jesus confirm a covenant? Yes, he did. In Luke chapter 22, he sat there with his disciples and said, this is the blood of the new covenant. And he established it with his disciples. For the many, in just a few short weeks, the church was growing, just rapidly growing, and there were many Jews who he did make the covenant with, and so that certainly fits. Next part of 27 says, but in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. In the middle of the week. Now again, we're talking about 7-year time frame. In the middle of that is 3.5 years. Incidentally, Jesus' ministry lasted, most Bible scholars, teachers agree, to be about 3.5 years. After 3.5 years, in the middle of that week, did he bring an end to sacrifice and offering? I think he did. As Jesus died on the cross, he brought an effectual end to sacrifices. If you're familiar with the writing of Hebrews chapter 10, for example, you'll know that that's exactly what the offering that Jesus did. It brought an end to the old system and introduced a new system. And in a sense, for those who follow Jesus, for those who are of his, there's no need to offer any more sacrifices. And so I see that Jesus, the Messiah, fits better without importing any idea from anywhere, the natural way to read it. And this is the way the church read it up until 1830 when Darby introduced dispensationalism. So I am taking just a very old school, conventional way of understanding Daniel chapter 9 and verse 27. Now, what about the last 3.5 years? Because it says in the middle he was cut off. Well, I'm not really clear about that. I'll be first to admit that. There are a number of theories out there, perhaps that Peter's vision in Cornelius' house and the opening of the gospel to the Gentiles might be seen as the end of that 7-year time frame. That has been suggested. Paul's Damascus conversion might have been seen as the end of the 3.5 years. I'm not really sure what that means, but I don't see that is necessary to understand it in the natural way. So if we read the passage of Scripture, letting it interpret itself, I believe that the most natural and easiest way to read Daniel chapter 9 is that Jesus is the one who's referred to in 27, and if that's the case, there is no evidence of a future 7-year tribulation, because Daniel doesn't support it, and those who believe in it always refer to this passage as their support, but I don't believe it gives the support that they think that it does. So is there a future 7-year tribulation? Well, my answer would be there might be. The Bible just doesn't tell us. With that, I'm going to go ahead and end this video. I hope to see you next time. Thanks for coming back to watch, and I hope to see you in future videos.